we can figure out how it works, and it's all the same ecology, basically. So, get the title straight. I'm going to throw in some facts here. This is just referring to the East River, which is actually not a river, but a tidal strait. So, fun fact going forward. So, the waterways in New York City is a really an archipelago. There's dozens and dozens of islands. And to me, so I work with the North Brooklyn Boat Club, which is a very new group in northern Brooklyn and Greenpoint, and we do canoeing, kayaking, but for me personally it's also a way to get people on waterways that we've been sort of kept from historically in New York City, and teach people about the history as well as the ecology and what's happening with the waterways. We're also on Newtown Creek, which is like Gowanus, a Superfund site, so I'll talk more about that later. So the history of the waterways in New York City, this is one of the big draws for the Dutch and the English coming here, was that there was so much water, and also the ecosystem was so lively. They had huge oysters, and it was a very good place for farming and all that stuff. So, it was the waterways were historically very, very active. This is from, I guess, maybe the 1920s or something like that. But you can see basically all these piers that we no longer have. Just all of Manhattan was surrounded by piers, and a lot of Brooklyn here as well. And eventually what happened was a lot of this was shipping that when the 50s came and the containers were invented, New York City kind of lost out, so to speak, to New Jersey. New Jersey sort of advanced a lot with their container technology, and New York was a little stubborn and still tried to keep the finger piers, and so we don't do as much shipping in the middle of the city. A lot of it's in Staten Island, some here in Red Hook, and New Jersey. So the history is one of a lot of use, but it's one of also a lot of abuse. Starting in the 19th century, you had so much industry and people using the waterways, but there was no regulation, so everybody was polluting, and that's basically why the Gowanus and Newtown Creek are the state they're in now. It's just this years and years, basically centuries of people dumping materials, and that's where we are. And so we get a lot of, this is one of these sort of old piers and stuff rotting away. But it's actually, to me, the waterways are also really inspiring because we've had this really long, awful history, but things are only going to get better from here. And they've also kind of become this neglected space in some ways, especially for a place like New York where everything is so contested, all the land is. The waterways are kind of, to me, this in some way a frontier of something that ecologically they're going to improve, and so we can sort of take grip from it. I also put this slide in because this is one sign of the water getting better is actually the return of the worms that eat the piers, and so it's kind of funny because a lot of wooden piers aren't as sturdy as they used to be because now the worms can actually survive in clean water. Okay, so this gets to, so basically what we've had historically, this is a real summary overview here. We've had all this pollution from the industry and people dumping whatever they want, and a lot of that has been, we made tremendous strides starting in the 60s and 70s to enforce that, so that's getting better. There's still a lot of sediment that's really, really bad in the creek, or in the whole estuary, but the main issue for pollution now is what we talked about earlier, Hans talked about at Gowanus Canal Conservancy, is the CSOs, combined sewer overflow, and that's the main source of pollution that's really affecting our waterways right now, and that's going to continue to affect our waterways because it's very difficult to take that so much sewage that's going and street runoff that's going to the waterways, and it's too late to sort of build a new system for it. So that is, of all the pollution that's entered the waterways, the CSO is kind of the main focus because, like you said, every time there's a quarter inch of rain, there's sewage, and not just sewage, but all the stuff from cars, nasty runoff is going into the waterways and affecting us. And that's, again, also why farming is important because you can divert some of that stuff. So what we have here, this is a map of, these aren't watersheds, but these are sewer sheds, if you will. So these are, all these little flags are wastewater treatment plants, and so there's 13 of them throughout the city. So each plant processes this area of all of the sewage and all the combined sewers from the street that goes to the plant. So, what else to say about this? It's kind of interesting, actually, to think about the geography, not from a watershed perspective, but sort of like the sewer shed. So, you'll see, like, so I live up in Greenpoint. Our boat club is right up here, and we're by the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment plant, which I believe is the biggest in the city. And you can see it's actually pretty interesting. We do this huge area of northern Brooklyn, but we also do most of lower Manhattan. And so thinking about it in that terms, the water that people are using in lower Manhattan actually affects people in Brooklyn, because it's all coming to us to get processed. So that's we might come back to this map, but this is just an interesting resource. Here is a map of all the combined sewer overflow outfall points. So there's about 460 throughout the city, which is about the number of subway stops. And so they're really everywhere. There's a bunch on the canal here, and they're all labeled with a green sign. And so it's really interesting. I think a lot of people who live in New York don't really realize that their toilet is directly connected to the waterways when there's a rainstorm. So 460 of them, let's see, 27 billion gallons of stormwater and sewage that's entering the waterways every year, which is really a tremendous amount. The other interesting thing, there's 460 of these, but they're different tiers. So some of them are kind of small and some of them are very large. And the tier 1's about 3.5% contribute about half or over half of the pollution itself, of the overflow. So it's kind of actually like a wealth distribution. We have a very small percent up top that's contributing large amounts. So this is a picture of what an overfall, I don't know if these are actually technically CSOs, but this is it. You know, it looks like this. I don't know if you guys have seen, there's a kind of infamous video of Gowanus, of one of the very large ones coming out of a rainstorm. It's pretty nasty. So these are something to look out to. Here is, it's a little dark here, but this is a big CSO outfall. So some of them are like pipes, and some are actually the size of, you know, like this little garage door. They're very gigantic. We have millions of gallons coming out. So this is one in Newtown Creek. This is the inside. This is actually people from the EPA going in a canoe, which was kind of fun. And this is a view inside. I also kind of threw this in here because I can't advertise this publicly too much, but this is looking out from one of the CSO outfalls. So you have these just gigantic drainage points of pushing water out into the waterways. Okay, so that's where we are. So you get, every rainstorm, you get stuff from the street, and you get sewage going to the waterways. It's bad for, I would say, the wildlife that's trying to live there, and it's also a concern of people that use the waterways recreationally. So this is New York City Water Trails Association threw off this past season. They did a testing of water quality to see how bad the water is in places where people are launching boats from, like kayaks and canoes. And so the Riverkeeper organization has been doing this for a number of years, and they test throughout, starting in Albany, coming all the way down to New York Harbor. And what this study was about, though, this is kind of a more citizen science thing, is a lot of different groups were testing where you would actually be at more risk of exposure to water. So Riverkeeper, as well as DEP and stuff, they test in the middle of the channel. And I felt like that wasn't a really good indicator of how bad the water is near the shoreline. So we did about 20 weeks of testing, and you go every week and take a sample of the water, and we're testing for a bacteria called Enterococcus, which is an indication of raw sewage. It's something that's in our system, and it's not harmful in itself, but it indicates other pathogens that are in the water. So it was a pretty fun project, and got some really interesting results. So we got, you know, I think there's 15 or 20 different spots throughout the city that we tested, and I helped do the one in northern Brooklyn. And I'll show you some of the results, because it's also interesting, you know, people have been in New York for a long time or grew up here have a sort of a fear of the water. That's, you know, it's where you dump bodies, and that's, you don't want to touch it. And I think it's important to know how bad the water is, especially in certain areas, because it does differentiate. So this is one of the cleaner sites, Pier 66, which is above Chelsea Piers, on the Hudson. And so just to explain this real quick, this is the EPA standards for swimmable water. So it's actually pretty good. So if you're in the green, is acceptable for swimming. So that means, like, you can go swimming in that water and you're not going to get sick. So you can actually see on the Hudson, it was in the green, you know, 90–95% of the time. Pretty good. This one in the red here, the yellow is sort of like, it's okay, you know, it's not great, but the red ones, you know, is when you don't want to go, you know, unacceptable for swimming. Also, this is kind of interesting to note too, because for people that are doing recreational kayaking, it's not the same thing as swimming, you know, you're usually not immersed, so anyways, it's good. This one you'll see, I'll show you some other results from different sites. This is the rainfall leading up to the testing, which is really good because you can draw these direct, you know, correlations between how much rainfall. So you see one day prior there was 1.76 inches of rainfall. I'll talk again about that, but that's in Central Park, so it's a general indication. There was a huge rainstorm a day before their testing, and that was the only red one they had. So they had 145, I think it's parts per million of the caucus. So they did pretty well.
Is the rain dirty, or the stuff the rain is washing into
It's sewage. This is measuring how much sewage is in the water, basically. So the rain compared to sewage is pretty good. Yeah. This is guanas. There was a couple spots that tested guanas, and yeah, it's pretty bad. And this is one of the worst throughout the harbor. So you can see the difference between the Hudson River, where it's pretty much almost always acceptable to go swimming, and here at guanas. And you can also see their numbers are really, some really high ones, 2,400, you know, is 5,700 compared to the other one at like 200. So this is pretty bad.
There are actually times when it's acceptable to swim.
Huh?
Yeah, the two green bars.
Yeah, I will also say that this is only measuring when you get to places like Gowanus and Newtown Creek. This is only measuring for sewage. It doesn't measure for heavy metals, PCBs, stuff like that. So you know, I'm not recommending that anyone go swimming in Newtown Creek or the Gowanus at any point, even if it's the intercoccus gun is low. Here's Newtown Creek. Oh, it's kind of dark. Anyways, it's sorry, Newtown Creek is more my expertise than Gowanus, so I'll admit my ignorance on locality here, but it's about 3.5 miles long, and our site is up near the Pulaski, and we're very close to the East River, so we actually get a lot of the tidal flushing. So you guys know there's a tide cycle 2 times every day, and it rises about 5 feet or so depending on the moons. But we get a lot of that current as well. So the currents in New York Harbor vary spot to spot, but they can get pretty strong, 3 or 4 knots in certain areas. So where we are, the water that's coming through, even though we're on Newtown Creek, just right there where my finger is, the water flushes through as well as it would in most spots in the East River. So it's actually, we're on the Newtown Creek, so people are a little worried, but being closer to the mouth of the East River is much better than being back here at the end of English Kills. Because this is a spot which is like, we saw down here in Gowanus, where it's a dead end, and there's none of that flushing happening. So a general rule of thumb of places like this, when you have these dead end tributaries, pollution is going to be much, much worse there. There's also conveniently huge CSO outfalls. Some of the really large ones are, there's one here, and one up there at the end of these outfalls. So sewage comes out, and it really doesn't flush out as well as if you were flushing it to the harbor. So Newtown Creek, so this is a couple different tests. This is Dutch Kills, which is kind of a tributary up here. It's kind of off the map, but it's one of these dead end spots. So Dutch Kills is pretty nasty, and you see the results aren't very good. You know, they had a couple days here, but overall not very good. And these ones were actually over 24,000 parts per million. So you know, you look at this, you're like, oh, 62, the water's okay. It's such a huge difference, and that's actually the test maxed out, so it could have been much more than that. So Dutch Kills.
Sewage flow out of the system.
How does it
move out of the system in such a short period of time?
It goes like, so from your toilet, it goes into the pipe and it gets diverted of where it would go to the wastewater treatment plant and goes to one of these
But that's
outfalls.
during a storm. But like once it goes into the waterway, how does it flush out of the system of the waterway system?
The clean water.
Yeah. The sewage water. How does it get
Oh.
out of the waterway?
It depends on how strong the tides or the currents are there.
And it
So
goes out to the sea.
yeah, ideally, but in a place like, but also you see some areas that are really these dead ends where there's not a lot of movement of the water, you get a lot of sediment. So you have the CSO outfall and then a lot of like sediment gravel stuff in front of it because it's pushing out all the small dirt and stuff from the street as well. But yeah,
So does that just all absorb into the land around it because it's not going anywhere? It's just a
this
long
sediment in
time?
the ground, yeah.
Is analysis of the CSO part of the EPA mandate for Superfund sites, or is it specifically?
Yeah, they're doing everything basically. They're testing all levels, so they're doing a pretty good job. I can talk more about super cells and stuff. Yeah.
There's no kind of flushing tunnel on
Newtown Creek? No. No, there's not. But generally, because the creek it flushes generally pretty well, except for those couple tributaries areas. Overall, I think it does all right. So here we have Dutch Kills, not very good. But this is our site, and like I said, we're kind of closer to the river, so you actually see the results. We were really happy with it, especially the first 5 weeks. We thought it flew. So it's Newtown Creek, it's a super fun site, but it's good to know what makes this area different. It's close to a river. It has a sort of natural flushing system, but of course you see this one 19,000 we had with a big rainstorm, and of course after Hurricane Sandy, everything is totally messed up. So this is this is also kind of dark, but we painted our results on our wall so that people were right by a pedestrian path, so people could sort of see them, and they could go to the URL shortener there and figure out. They go to that web page and get the results. So this is sort of a way to inform public that sewage goes into the water and we're testing for it. And hey, we're on Newtown Creek, but it's not. Some places aren't as bad as you might think. So I'm just gonna blow through some of this other stuff. So that's one issue, is you have all the sewage and all the other stuff that we're not testing for as well. Heavy metals or oil, petroleum coming from the street. Which after Hurricane Sandy down on the creek and a lot of places throughout the harbor, just so much oil and stuff like that. You talked about the tar. So a lot of stuff that got thrown into the waterways. There's also much more visible. There's just flotsam that gets thrown into the waterways during not just rainstorms, but the waterways are these sort of catch-all for if you have a plastic cup or a styrofoam cup and it blows into the waterway, it's going to stay there and it's not really going to decompose. So I personally got really interested in sort of understanding the flotsam in the harbor and maybe where it goes. And it's a problem because it does affect wildlife in some sense, and it's also this visual problem. But I also think the more of the physical flotsam you can see, the more you can understand. There's probably nasty stuff with it. So the tidal trash is what I've gotten kind of interested in following, and finding spots where this stuff will accumulate. So a lot of New York City waterways, like Manhattan, or the canal here, are bulkheaded, right? So there's no natural shoreline. So once something enters the waterways, it's really hard for it to wash ashore. So New York City, that was originally just this very intricate gray shorelines that provided a lot of, and it's a very vital habitat to have. All the grasslands and stuff, a lot of that has been sort of cut off. And it's kind of hard to actually find spots where trash will wash up naturally. And so in some of the, going around New York City and looking for places where trash will wash up naturally, this is a lot of really dense amount of plastic and stuff like that washing up on Jamaica Bay. Again, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but all sorts of stuff washing up. This is a project I did of finding just cigarette lighters, which is like one item that I found kind of common around beaches. And in sort of seeing how many cigarette lighters I could find in a year around the city, I found the most around Jamaica Bay, which is partially because you have those more natural shorelines. So, you can see Manhattan, it's all bulkheads. There's nowhere for the trash to land. So, I'm not sure what this has to do with farming necessarily, but it's interesting to think about the shorelines and how they were a very, the grasslands and the wetlands and stuff like that were very, very vital and still are vital, especially in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. Those are sponges that absorb tidal surges. So it's interesting to think of understanding a map of New York City in these different ways of, we don't look at watersheds, we can look at sewer sheds. We don't look at, we can understand stuff as how the shorelines are affiliated. So something to think about. These are some of the lighters I found. A couple of pictures here. So, to me, I think it's kind of interesting of finding these old products, and also a bigger, investigation of plastic pollution, stuff like that, and our consumer habits of how plastic is so many awful effects. This I threw in kind of for fun. So New York City, I mentioned, is archipelago. There's about 600 miles of coastline in the city itself, which is pretty tremendous to think about. And these are a list of some of the more, are these all the islands? Maybe these are the more unknown islands in New York City. So it's kind of incredible to think about, you know, the city's so small and dense in a lot of ways, but there's so many places, I guess it's all of Manhattan, but there's so many places that, you know, islands people have never heard of. And most of these are like wildlife preserves now. At one point, they might have had some activity in the 19th century. And so these are all throughout the harbor, so they're really interesting if you guys have any questions about any of the islands.
Yeah, what's Rat Island?
Yeah.
Rat Island is, don't want to go there. It's up towards the Bronx, near City Island. It's small, uninhabited, you know, the islands of choice. There's some pretty interesting ones. There's one Hog Island up there, which was interesting also in the wake of Sandy, was similar to Rockaway, was a barrier island further out in the ocean and was totally destroyed in the Hurricane 1895, I think. And it's no longer an island. It was this island and it was destroyed by hurricanes. So it's kind of interesting to think about that in relation to, and people lived on it and the natives used it for harvesting. So it's kind of interesting to think about that in terms of storms in New York City that, you know, can have a landmass and totally disappear. So that's kind of to sum up, and a little bit open up to questions. So, you know, my sort of three issues that I have with the waterways in New York City. One is the issue of overflow, that there's not a lot of awareness of the mine sewer overflow. And it's also a little, in northern Brooklyn especially, like other parts of the city, there's so much development happening where you have these pieces of land that were kind of just laying empty, now they're building huge development projects on it, and they're not doing, you know, it's kind of adding more residents that are going to be flushing their toilets and running their laundry and taking showers and producing more wastewater, but it's also, you know, we're sort of putting more concrete on the area, so there's going to be more runoff coming with more people coming to the city. So overflow is a very big issue, not just for the sewage, but all the stuff on the street. And that's something I think everybody should think about, how you can plant. You know, tree pits make a big difference, impermeable pavement, rooftop gardens and stuff like that. Not even rooftop gardens, but the blue roofs and stuff like that. The shorelines, you know, a lot of, especially like we're talking about with storms and stuff like that, having non-bulkheaded shores like this is on the creek, and that's actually the wastewater treatment plant. So that's, you know, the overflow, and then the shoreline, you know, thinking about designing shores in the city that can act like a natural sponge and bring back some of the natural habitat. Also those intertidal zones that we used to have, the grasslands and stuff like that, the marshlands is such a vital habitat for birds and other organisms. And then use, you know, there's not, it's interesting, you know, I tell people I go boating out in the waters, and in my own, when I first got into it, you know, is that legal? Is there regulations? And there's actually not a lot of regulations on human-powered boating at all. Which isn't to say everybody should just go, you know, buy a kayak and jump out there, because it is treacherous in certain parts. But that there's so much potential for the waterways in New York City, and then at one point it was such a vast place of not just recreation, but, you know, all these small ferries, people going out fishing and stuff like that. That it's, you know, Bloomberg is sort of, you know, the sixth borough is sort of getting into using the waterways, but it's interesting at this point because you can sort of think about it. It's open to use on so many different levels. So, you know, I encourage people to think about the waterways as an unused space in a dense city. Yeah.